welcome to this edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mireles, and I'm your host here in Harlingen, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley of deep South Texas. A little later in today's program, our San Diego correspondent, Salvador Rivera, is going to be speaking with Genesis Lara with the ACLU of Arizona about the hidden process for migrants in ICE custody waiting to be deported. But first, as always, let's go ahead and start this afternoon by taking a look at what's trending across the border, starting in Minnesota, where nearly a dozen government vehicles or rentals driven by federal officials were vandalized last night. All of the SUVs were spray painted with the word ICE on them at the Residence Inn by Marriott Hotel in Eagan, Minnesota, which is just south of Minneapolis. Now, some published reports say profanity and threats to Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem were also sprayed on those vehicles. Allie Bradley with our partners at News Nation has reached out to DHS for a statement. We'll get that to you as soon as we get it on BorderReport.com. ICE says last night they arrested a dozen protesters in Minneapolis for allegedly assaulting law enforcement officials. We told you yesterday President Trump is threatening to invoke the Insurrection Act in Minnesota following clashes between demonstrators and federal immigration officers. That warning comes after another officer-involved shooting this week and renewed outrage over the death of Renee Good last week. Our Washington correspondent Rashad Hudson has more.
Protests continue to grow in Minneapolis after a week of clashes between demonstrators and federal enforcement officers. And now, a new warning from President Donald Trump.
The Insurrection Act is a tool at the president's disposal. As you know, it has been used sparingly, but it has been used.
The law would allow the president to deploy active duty U.S. troops or federalize the National Guard to interfere with protests. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem says the president has the power to act.
He certainly has the constitutional authority to utilize that.
The threat comes a day after an immigration officer shot and wounded a man in Minneapolis. Noem calls it self-defense.
3 individuals weaponized shovels and brooms and attack an ICE officer that had to defend himself.
Democrats in Congress accuse the administration of escalating tensions.
His operations rely on brutal tactics, avoiding de-escalation and due process against U.S. citizens.
You look away from what this president is doing is another day that our neighbors face unimaginable cruelty at the hands of their own government.
The White House says no final decision has been made on deploying troops, but DHS says the option is actively being reviewed as protests continue and security concerns grow. As for ICE leaving Minneapolis anytime soon, the White House says that is not happening. Reporting in Washington, Rashad Hudson.
And coming back down here to the Texas-Mexico border, earlier this week we told you about recent deaths at the Fort Bliss ICE detention center known as Camp East Montana in El Paso. Well, new reporting from the Washington Post says now that the El Paso County's Office of the Medical Examiner will likely classify the January 3rd death of Geraldo Lunas Campos as a homicide. The 55-year-old Cuban national died after experiencing a medical distress, according to the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The agency says Lunas Campos was disruptive while in line for medication and refused to return to his assigned dorm. During the struggle, staff saw Lunas Campos in distress and contacted medical personnel. But according to the Washington Post, an employee of the medical examiner told the man's daughter that the office will likely classify his death as a homicide. The employee said a doctor at the facility is listing the preliminary cause of death as asphyxia due to neck and chest compressions. Now, in an interview with the Post, a man who was detained in the same unit as Lunas Campos said he saw at least 5 guards struggling with Lunas Campos after he refused to enter the segregation unit. The man said he heard Lunas Campos repeatedly saying, "No puedo respirar," which in English means, "I can't breathe." Lunas Campos was arrested last summer in Rochester, New York. He had been convicted of several charges. This is the second death reported at Camp East Montana in El Paso in the less than 5 months that it has been operating. Lunas Campos was one of the thousands of migrants sitting in an ICE detention facility waiting for the next step in the deportation process, a process that some groups say is often hidden from the public eye. And one of those groups is the ACLU of Arizona. And here to expand on that today, joining us now, our San Diego correspondent Salvador Rivera, and our guest for today's program, Genesis Lara, a writer with the ACLU of Arizona. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Rudy. And Genesis, before we get into your investigation, the things that you have uncovered, why don't you fill us in on your background as a journalist, as an investigator? Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be with the ACLU of Arizona.
Hi, of course. First of all, thank you for having me. So, to touch a little bit on my background, I studied journalism and have worked as a journalist most of my career. And I used to work as a reporter in Tucson, Arizona at the Arizona Daily Star. And then most recently, I worked as managing editor of the Nogales International in Nogales, Arizona, which is a small border town here.
Mhm. Okay, so then you come to work with ACLU of Arizona. Tell us what propelled you, why you decided to look into what's going on with migrants who are in ICE custody in Arizona.
Right. So when I began working with the ACLU of Arizona, it was specifically for this project, which is about uncovering the impact of US border and immigration policies. So being from Nogales, I knew that I wanted to partner with the Kino Border Initiative. It's a humanitarian organization based in Nogales, Sonora, in Mexico, that provides humanitarian aid for migrants who are in that border city, who have most recently been deported through there. And when I connected with them, they informed me that they were visiting the government run shelter in that city about 5 times a week. And the point of these visits was to, one, inform them about the services that their organization provides, but two, also speak with these migrants and ask them about their experiences while they were in ICE custody so that they could better document any patterns of offenses or abuses that they might be seeing. And so when they informed me about that, they allowed me to tag along with them for these visits.
hmm Tell us about the timeline, how long this investigation took place.
This was about a 1 month long investigation. So I would accompany the Kino Border Initiative about once a week throughout the whole month of December. But even when I wasn't attending these visits with them, I was still in constant communication with them about the trends that they were seeing, any patterns that were changing or shifting during the time that I wasn't with them.
And what did you find out initially?
So pretty quickly after visiting this shelter, I realized that most people had been detained in other states and then transferred to Arizona, where they were then prepared for their deportation to Nogales, Sonora. And once you speak with these migrants, we started hearing a lot of the same patterns, that they were being constrained by their wrists and ankles when they were arrested, that they were denied food, water, and even bathroom access for hours at a time. Some also described being given food that was rotten. Others mentioned being overcrowded in small spaces with a lot of detainees there. And then in the most dire cases, they were also denied urgent medical care.
Tell us how these people came to be in ICE custody. Were most of them caught in raids or as they showed up for appointments? How did they come to be in ICE custody and arrested or detained?
It's really a combination of things, but I want to say that most of them were were pulled over by local law enforcement, whether that was sheriff's deputies in their area, police officers, who then, they told them that they had either mistaken them for, a suspect in another case. So they felt like they were being racially profiled, is what they told me. And then others were pulled over for simple things such as a broken tail light. And then once they were pulled over, the officers would ask to see their IDs or their driver's license. And many of them would turn over their Mexican passports, for example, or some of them, even if they turned in their state license, driver's license, the officer would still inquire more about, their immigration status in the US. And then that's when they would then refer them to ICE. In other cases, it seemed like ICE was already doing some sort of investigation or possibly even racially profiling people as well. And then it would also happen on the street while they were driving to work most of the time.
hmm You mentioned medical neglect at this facilities. Here in San Diego, we've heard of people who had diabetes and they were denied insulin. Can you think of any examples of what was going on to people who were being held by ICE?
Yes, so there was this one case. This isn't a woman that I interviewed myself, but this was a woman that the Keno Border Initiative interviewed and then informed me about her case. And this woman, she had an eye condition that required her to use contact lenses and take medication. And during detention, she was in detention for about a year, and during that time, she was ignored whenever she asked for her medication or for new contact lenses. So she had to use the same pair of contact lenses for a full year that she was in detention, which then led to an infection that left her with only about 30% of her vision by the time that she was deported to Nogales, Sonora.
Mhm. And she was kept for a year? It seems excessive. Is that something, another pattern that you came across?
Not with many. I think her case might have been a little different because she hadn't lived in the United States for very long. She had crossed into the United States with the hope of requesting asylum. But then when they were processing her, they just kept her in detention.
We're speaking with Genesis Lara, a writer with the ACLU of Arizona, about what the experience that migrants have as they wait for deportation in ICE detention facilities. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to continue the conversation on the other side. So stay with us. Border Report Live is back in 2 minutes. And welcome back to Border Report Live. Time now to get back to our conversation with Genesis Lara, a writer for the ACLU of Arizona, about the process that migrants experience while waiting for deportation.
Genesis, one of the things that you write about, you mentioned your concern with the lack of transparency within ICE and Border Patrol. What did you mean by that?
I think our executive director, Victoria Lopez of the ACLU of Arizona, put it pretty precisely is that, the fact that these agencies operate with such a lack of transparency shows us what happens and how these agencies operate when they know that oversight is limited. And so I think experiences like these that all of these people shared with me, it kind of proves that authorities are many times not respecting the civil rights of many immigrants in our country. And the thing is that, as Victoria Lopez put it, the US Constitution protects all people in the United States, regardless of immigration status. But, again, these stories show that those rights aren't being respected.
Mhm. Were you shocked by what you found out about what people were telling you?
I think I was shocked in the sense that it's always very horrifying to hear what people go through in immigration detention. But at the same time, I don't think I was shocked in the sense that it was new to me because unfortunately, a lot of these circumstances we have been hearing about over and over for so many years. So no, I think this was last year, the ACLU of Arizona partnered with several organizations to write a report about how ICE and US Border Patrol often take away migrants' belongings. So that could be cell phones, IDs, or cash or credit cards. And they confiscate these when they're going to take them to detention centers. But then upon deportation, these items aren't returned to them. And at that point, shortly after that report was published, the Department of Homeland Security issued an order instructing officers to stop that practice, that if they were going to confiscate these belongings, they had to return these items upon deportation. But we have seen through recent interviews with people who have been recently deported, that practice is still happening.
Talk about the deportation process, the transfer from a facility into Mexico, for example. What did you find out from that end?
So right there, most people shared with me that they had been detained in other states aside from Arizona. So that I spoke with people from Washington, from California, Idaho. Many of them had already been living in the United States for years. And when they were detained, most of the time, they were held in detention centers within their state for a few days, or most often, with the people that I spoke with, up to a week. And then on the final 2 days of their detention, they would be transferred to Arizona, first by plane and then by bus, um, where they would then just hold them while they were preparing them for deportation. And then all the people that I spoke with were then deported through Nogales, Sonora.
Mhm. Any idea why Arizona? Is that just like a staging area for deportations, as far as you know?
I'm not sure. And, it's not something that I was really able to gauge with a lot of the migrants that I spoke with, because many of them were so disoriented after being held in detention for so long that they didn't even know where they had been held. They just knew they were in Arizona, but not even like what detention facility they were held at specifically.
Mhm. Was there a common thread? Were they all asylum seekers who perhaps were rejected by the courts or never really got a chance at the legal process? What did you find out about the people, the commonalities that bound these people together?
I think most of the people that I spoke with had already been living in the United States for at least a year, but usually more than a year. But I still want to say that there was a good mix. Some people had just recently tried to enter the United States through the desert for the first time. Others had been deported previously, but they, after spending, a big portion of their lives in the United States, and were trying to reunite with their families. And then others had been held in detention after requesting asylum, and it just didn't pan out the way they had hoped.
hmm Let me ask you this: as a journalist, sometimes there's self-satisfaction from doing an investigation or a specific story. Are you glad you took this assignment on?
I am glad, because I think that these experiences need to be talked about more often. And I think we need to, I don't want to say give migrants a voice, but give them a platform to use their voices. If migrants, for example, are filing complaints with federal agencies over the ways that they were treated, but then those complaints don't really go anywhere, I think it's important for the rest of the community, other organizations, to uplift their voices so that the general public finds out about these patterns of abuses and offenses by federal agencies.
hmm A lot of people, especially those in the White House right now, they label migrants, asylum seekers, as the worst of the worst, or the troublemakers, criminals. Are these the people you discovered, you found out that you talked to?
Not at all. Actually, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because when I would start interviewing people at the migrant shelter, so many of them would start off the interview with saying, I've never committed a crime. I don't even drink. I don't smoke. I just go to work and go back to home. So, that wasn't my experience with the people that I spoke with.
Mhm. Discuss a little bit, and let's backtrack the access portion. I know here in San Diego, we have a lot of difficulty getting near migrants, asylum seekers, just to talk to them, to get their side of the story, their perspective as to what might be going on. So tell us about how you were able to actually get face to face with the people in custody.
It was really all thanks to the Kino Border Initiative in Nogales, Sonora, because this government run shelter is actually a first of its kind for that border city. Previously it was humanitarian organizations that created shelters. But, in anticipation of these mass deportations that President Trump was announcing, the the federal government in Mexico began equipping municipal governments along the border to create these migrant shelters so that they could better accommodate this new population that was going to be entering the country. And so I knew that that shelter was actually very, it has high security and it's very closed off to the media and members of the public. And so I knew that I wasn't going to be able to access that shelter on my own. But luckily, by the time that I contacted the Kino Border Initiative, they had already, struck a deal with the municipal government that they would be allowed to visit the shelter every week so that they could inform these migrants about the services that they provide in case they need more food or clothing or shelter after their time at the government-run shelter is up. So, I was lucky and I'm very grateful that they allowed me to tag along with them.
Has there been, and I would imagine there has been, pushback, finger pointing, being labeled an agitator? Have you experienced any of those negative things that often happen to journalists who report on subjects that may not please everyone?
Luckily, I haven't. I've actually so far experienced the opposite. There have been people, recognizing how important it is to give a platform to these kinds of experiences and try to hold our federal agencies accountable.
In general, how would you describe what ICE is doing, Border Patrol, CBP, specific to Arizona, where you are working?
I would say it's a violation of constitutional rights of these immigrants because, immigrants are protected by the Constitution from being subjected to cruel and unusual punishment. But that's basically what ICE is doing right now when they're holding these people in detention because, they're withholding water and food and bathroom access from them. So I would kind of call that cruel and unusual punishment when, the federal authorities are denying the most essential resources that one needs to survive.
We've been speaking with Genesis Lara, a writer with the ACLU of Arizona, about the process that migrants experience while waiting for deportation in an ICE detention facility. Thank you so much for joining us, but unfortunately, we are out of time today, Genesis.
Thank you.
All righty, well, stay with us. We've got a few more headlines when we come back, including some developing news on the comments that President Trump made about invoking the Insurrection Act. New reporting from our partners on the Hill when we come back. Border Report Live is back in 2 minutes. And welcome back to this edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mideles here in Harlingen, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley of deep South Texas. Now to that developing news on the president's threats to invoke the Insurrection Act. So shortly before he took off for Mar-a-Lago, which is where we just saw him speaking a moment ago, he told reporters at the White House today that there is no reason for him to invoke the Insurrection Act. Again, just one day after he threatened to use the law in the wake of demonstrations in Minneapolis. He said, quote, "I don't think there's any reason right now to use it, but if I needed it, I'd use it." Now, keep in mind, Trump threatened to use the 1807 law on Thursday following that shooting that involved a federal officer. So we're going to stay on top of this, and we'll keep you updated both here on Border Report Live as well as always on borderreport.com. One last headline to tell you about this afternoon, and that is dozens of clergy and faith leaders gathered outside the Minneapolis headquarters of Target on Thursday to demand the superstore take action against ICE after federal agents reportedly detained 2 Target employees who are U.S. citizens at a store in Richfield, Minnesota, just south of Minneapolis. Border Patrol agents stopped at a Target store last week and arrested 2 U.S. citizens, Democratic State Representative Michael Howard told reporters. A state lawmaker says federal agents, including Greg Bovino, senior commander of U.S. Border Patrol, entered Target without a warrant, physically assaulted and arrested 2 Target employees. Coworkers have described the experience as traumatic. And before we go, we wanted to remind you to check out our partners at Political Power Ranker. It's a weekly show tracking the movers and shakers and rule makers in American politics. Nextstar's Director of Political Content, Chris Berg, and Director of Emerson College Polling, Spencer Kimball, break down who's up and who's down in the world of politics based on data. And this week, Spencer's got some new polling that shows Ken Paxton and John Cornyn neck and neck in the Texas Senate primary poll. It's going to be a good one. Gromer Jeffers from the Dallas News joins the pair on this week's edition, so don't miss it. That does it for us today. We'll see you next time.